Over the years, one thing that's typically been commonplace with each new Halo release is the use of familiar maps from previous games making an appearance in some way or another in a new game. So one thing that was very interesting with Halo Infinite was with the 10 maps that were featured in multiplayer at launch, none of these were actual remakes from any previous Halo game. This of course got Luke and I just talking about remakes in general, and we couldn't help but to think about some of the maps that have definitely gotten more love than other maps in the Halo franchise, and then we were wondering which Halo map actually has been remade the most out of all of the Halo maps across the board, and what actually classifies as a remake or just an inspiration. This ended up becoming this huge debate and this crazy, ridiculous conversation where we're classifying map remakes, map inspirations, partial map remakes. It's really interesting, and we wanted to figure out which map definitively has been in the most Halo games to date, while also appreciating some of the other maps that have had variations over the years. Now, of course, there's a ton of maps that have appeared in just 2 Halo games, where it appeared once, and then later it was brought back, and it was kind of cool. But then there's some other maps that have been utilized a little bit more, and matter of fact, there's actually quite a few maps that have appeared on 3 occasions minimum, and while that, of course, isn't the most times a map has appeared in a Halo game, it's a good place to start because we can start to see what the criteria was for whether or not a map would return for a Halo game. For instance, Wizard was a Halo Combat Evolved map, and while it's a little weird to actually go on and play in Combat Evolved, it was reworked and brought back for Halo 2 in the form of Warlock. Warlock, on the other hand, ended up becoming a very popular map in the Halo 2 Xbox Live days, and it didn't actually see any official iteration in Halo Reach or Halo 4 even. It was one of the maps that was selected to be included in Halo 2 Anniversary, this time with an overhaul, bringing the graphical and visual fidelity up, and it's still a really cool map to go back and look at. We see another similar map, but this time around a map that appeared on 3 occasions as well, but a Halo 3 map included, with Halo 2's Zanzibar, which looked great, but then if you went to Last Resort, which was the Halo 3 variation, you immediately could see the graphical improvements from Halo 2 to Halo 3, having a location that was already a commonplace location from Halo 2. It was a little while before we would see this location revisited again, but Halo 2A did bring it back in the form of Stone Town, and once again, things have changed a bit on the map, but it still is that classic Zanzibar aesthetic appearance that we all know and love. And then if we want to think more abstractly, we can look at Sidewinder from Halo Combat Evolved, which was a pretty big map that a lot of people really liked back in those local LAN party days, and this map eventually did make its way back into Halo 3 in DLC as Avalanche, and while it was reworked quite a bit and refined, the Halo 3 version ended up becoming a very popular big team battle map for the years to come after its release, and when 343 and Microsoft tried to release Halo Online as this free-to-play game in Russia, they actually reworked Avalanche and created Diamondback, which is a desert version of Avalanche, and canonically it takes place on a different planet and it's not a Halo ring, but it is very interesting nonetheless just to see this very different aesthetic on a very popular map. This is one of the maps I do hope we eventually get to see come to the Master Chief Collection, as we've gotten to see other maps that we've really desperately wanted to see make its way over there. So hopefully this one doesn't get forgotten about and will eventually be included in the Master Chief Collection as well. And while these ones were easy, we could count the 3 different versions of the maps, things get a little more confusing when it comes to map classifications when we start to consider maps from Halo Reach, because with Halo Reach, we saw Forge World and the ability of Forge to pretty much bring any idea to life in some form or another. And there's a ton of fan-made remakes of older maps from previous Halo games in Forge World, so which maps would we actually include? Obviously, for the sake of this video, the criteria as to whether or not we could include a remake would have to consider whether or not there's an official 343 or Bungie made map, and how was that map released? Was it a part of the base game when it initially came out, and was it in matchmaking rotation? This did help in some ways clarify some things with map remakes, for our list, but it still gets a little more confusing as we move forward. For instance, we have Ascension from Halo 2, which was a pretty fun, popular map. It was great for small teams, but sometimes some big team chaos could happen on there as well. And this map was remade in Halo Reach as the map Pinnacle, which takes place on Forge World. And then it also was remade again in Halo 2 Anniversary as Zenith, which is an official map. So we had to bring into question, since this is a Forge World map and not actually Ascension, do we count it? And Luke and I decided that this map should in fact be included in the list because it was a launch map at release. It wasn't a map you could remove from your map listings, even if it was a sub-variant of Forge World. This also stood true for Halo Reach's Asylum, which was a remake of Halo 2's Sanctuary, which was another very popular map that also came back again in Shrine. But then we run into a more confusing issue with Valhalla, for example, from Halo 3, as this map not only was inspired by the Blood Gulch before it, but definitely isn't Blood Gulch, but then was remade in Halo 4 as Ragnarok. And then there's a Halo 5 map called Parallax that has a remake of Valhalla called Viking, which is similar to the way that Forge World has its own remakes from Halo 2 maps. Now, the problem where this gets really confusing is even though some of these maps would go into official rotation, they weren't actually created by staff who work on Halo. They were great, very well done maps made by community members, but unfortunately this specific one doesn't make the cut. But then we look at Headlong from Halo 2, which was a really cool map. Just anything where you get to be in the city is fun to be in, which was brought back for Halo Reach's Combat Evolved Anniversary map pack as Breakneck, and another great variation of a map, one of the ones that actually made Reach maps feel really great. And much like the Parallax Viking map, there was a Breakneck / Headlong remake in Halo 5 Guardians. This is looking like a similar case to the Parallax one we just talked about. It actually falls in a different category here because this map was made by a community member, however, was also assisted by 343 Industries before its official launch. And considering that's what it says in the description here, where Parallax Viking doesn't have that, in these very weird instances, we're going to go ahead and count the Breakneck remake as an official map, as it also came out to correspond with DLC releasing, where unfortunately the very cool Viking Ragnarok Valhalla remake doesn't end up getting a point here. But while we have a lot of groups of maps that had 3 variations, it gets really interesting when we start to go into the upper levels of this list, where we maybe look at some maps that potentially have 4 versions existing across all of the Halo games. There's not that many that even get to the point of having 4 variations, but before we can fully classify some of these maps with 4 variations, we run into more problems defining what actually counts as a remake and what counts as a reimagination, and then again, what also counts as an official map. One of my favorite instances of this to point out is Hang'em High, as Hang'em High existed in Combat Evolved, was brought back as Tombstone in Halo 2, and in Halo Reach's Combat Evolved Anniversary map pack was reinvented as High Noon, and that obviously puts it in the part where it would have at least 3 versions. However, we run into a problem when we look at the map Longshore. Now, Longshore started out as a remake for Hang'em High, and it drew inspiration in its early days as a Hang'em High-like remake. And you can really feel Hang'em High if you walk through this map right after playing Hang'em High or vice versa. So I'm always in the camp that likes to see Longshore as this evolved version of Hang'em High. Every time I play on the map, I can't help but to think of Hang'em High and Tombstone because of this knowledge that I have, though I don't think anyone who doesn't know about this necessarily jumps straight to Hang'em High because the map is still quite different. Essentially, it's Hang'em High if there was this building in the middle that had a frozen fish section, then it's Longshore. But other than that, there's not too much connecting these two maps together. So do we fall in the category where we count Hang'em High as a map that has had 4 variations over the years, or does this one only count as 3? We're still in debate about this, so you can let us know what you think in the comments down below. But nonetheless, for this ranking, we're going to go ahead and give it a half point for Longshore, putting it in at 3.5, in between the 2 categories of maps with 3 variations and maps with 4 variations. Okay, so our score is looking a little interesting. We're starting to tally up things and we're getting some interesting exceptions, but then we get to Battle Creek, and this is another one that gets really confusing where to place it because it very obviously it has 3 variations. We have Battle Creek from Halo Combat Evolved, Beaver Beaver Creek from Halo 2, and then in Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary's Reach DLC, we ended up with Battle Canyon. Now, of course, when Halo 2 Anniversary was coming around, there was a lot of maps that were in consideration to be remade, but I think because Battle Canyon was put in Halo Reach, they decided not to include it. However, in a vidoc for Halo 2 Anniversary showing off what you're capable of doing in Forge, they showed off a 343 made Beaver Creek remake, which would be available to play. However, the game wasn't included as a variant in the Master Chief Collection, though it was an official map that 343 had made to show off what the capabilities of Halo 2A's Forge would look like. So we're kind of stuck here. This doesn't really count, but it's very close to being the same situation we had with Reach and its Forge World maps. So reluctantly here, we don't want to overly do half points, but we kind of feel like there's no other option. We feel like at the very least, this version of Beaver Creek should count for a half point at the very least, putting Battle Creek in the same category as the Hang 'em High situation where we have 3.5 points. All right, then things get more complicated, never easier when we get to maps that could potentially have 5 variations. First off, we have Midship and Heretic. Those were the Halo 2 and Halo 3 versions of this map. And then, of course, we know that in Halo 5 Guardians, we had Regret and also this map, Truth. However, one of those maps was only released in the Halo 5 Guardians beta at first, and then Regret would be added 2 weeks into the beta later on as a different map variation, and when Halo 5 released, both of these maps were included, though it was always insinuated that Truth and Regret are remixes of each other, in a remake of Heretic and Midship, of course. So while in a way it could count as one map, since they are separate entries and not just a map variation, we are going to count these as 2 separate maps featured in Halo 5 Guardian. So that easily puts this one into the category of 4, but then when we look at Halo Reach, it gets even more confusing because we have this map Zealot, which is often looked at as a remake of Midship and Heretic, though it very much isn't a remake, as there's a bottom level and this upper sky level that's not there in the main version of the map. Plus, the area itself seems to be a little bit wider, though the inspiration and a lot of the layout still is very similar to that of Heretic and Midship. So figuring out whether or not we're going to give it credit for the map Zealot definitely gets a bit more complicated. If we look at criteria in other Halo games as what counts as a remake and not really a remake, look at Sidewinder to Avalanche. They still look drastically different, but the bones are the same here, and the setting is mostly the same, and there's no real question as to whether or not those 2 maps are remakes. During development of Zealot, the map was originally called Aft Ship, which is an obvious reference to Midship, with the aft of the ship being the nautical terminology for the rear of the ship. And then out of all of the names they could have named it to, they named it to Zealot, which is a literary opposite of what a heretic would be in religious symbolism. So I think for those reasons alone, and the similarities in the map layout and the design itself, we can give it at least a half a point, counting it as a partial remake of Midship and of Heretic, as very obviously they wanted this map to be the Reach experience on board a Covenant ship in multiplayer. But if you disagree, you can let us know in the comments. Let's get some like really stupid over-the-top debate going on, and just no one accept anyone's answer. Let's just say no you and just see where it goes from there. Okay, so then potentially here that puts us up to a map that has 4.5 different remakes over the years, making this one of the highest contenders we've seen so far. But now we got to get into more complicated areas, more debatable topics when we talk about the map Lockout, because this one has a very tricky history and it's not very explicit or black and white as we progress along through it. All right, so the most obvious ones here, Lockout was remade in Halo 3 as Blackout. That's not very debated, other than the fact that Blackout's map layout isn't exactly quite lined up properly with Lockout. It doesn't really play the same way, but it still is a remake. That was very clear when it released. And then Halo 2 Anniversary, we were given Lockdown, which is a pretty faithful remake to the original original Lockout. So those three, they're pretty easy to define. Now we get into a little rougher territory when we look at some other maps that are a little bit more of a stretch. If you guys didn't know about some of Halo map history, there was a version of Lockout that was originally planned for Combat Evolved called the Cage, and it never really left conceptual phases, and when Halo 2 was in development, the Cage was brought back and expanded upon, and thus Lockout was created. Though the Lockout we saw in Halo 2 was a different version from that original The Cage map. When Halo Reach came around, the Cage was brought back to life in its original glory as one of those default built-in maps in Halo Reach's Forge World. Much like the maps we talked about earlier, Pinnacle from Halo Reach, that was put into Forge World, but it was released in the disc of the game as one of the main settings. So, in a sense, the Cage counts as an official map, but does its lineage connecting it to Lockout and Blackout and Lockdown stay connected? Because in a way, it's a pre-remake of a map. I mean, Lockout wouldn't have existed if the Cage didn't exist, and the Cage existing again kind of keeps it in line with Lockout, but I couldn't look at the Cage and be like, this is a remake, and I can't look at Lockout thinking this is a remake of the Cage, because Lockout came out before the Cage. See where this gets really confusing? I think I want to give it a point here, but I don't know. Then we can look at Guardian, Halo 3's map, which very often people say is not a remake of Lockout, and initially Luke and I talked about this, we both were in agreement. This does not count as a Lockout remake. It is too different, it looks aesthetically different, and it plays different enough. But the more and more we look at it, the harder time we start to have making the argument that, to an extent, this map shouldn't count as a Lockout remake. Sure, this map came out in Halo 3, and it became the mainstay competitive map for Halo 3 in the same way that Lockout was so popular in Halo 2. If you actually stand on the map and you look at the middle where the grav lift is on your left, and like there's some trees and stuff on your right and across from you, and then you mirror that, it really starts to feel a whole lot more like Lockout when you look at it from that perspective. Looking at the concept art, I can kind of see some similarities. And apparently one of the designers who worked on this map was Luke Timmons. And while internally at Bungie, this map was often referred to as the Jub Jub Forest, a reference to Star Wars, Halopedia has a note here saying that it was also referenced as Lookout as a reference to Luke Timmons. And of course, Lockout. Then, just to fuel the discussion more as to whether or not there's connections between Guardian and Lockout, Frank O'Connor chimed in randomly saying Guardian was never intended to replace Lockout, but it does share approximate scale and game type suitability. Guardian is Guardian. So if we give half points for some of these more questionable ones on Lockout, we would have 3 variations, a half point for Guardian and a half point for the Cage, bringing us up to a map that potentially has 4 versions here. But then, much like we talked about earlier with that Beaver Creek Halo Forge map reveal that never actually made its way into the game, during the reveal of Forge World in a Bungie vidoc, we see an official Lockout map that was made internally at Bungie that was in consideration for release within Halo Reach that never actually ended up shipping with the copy, much like the special case we ran into with Battle Creek. So the map exists, it is out there and it's playable, but it didn't actually ship on the game, which would have given it a full point as a remake. But since it still was made by Bungie, we'll just follow the same precedent we set up with Beaver Creek and count this as an extra half point, bringing this up to a map that has 3 full maps and 3 maps that kind of count. Maybe we're just gonna go ahead and say 4.5 points. It gets to rank there a little bit better than Hang 'em High and Beaver Creek, but still, it's not quite something we can be like, yeah, there's 6 versions of this map, easy. But the big winner, fortunately enough for us, wasn't actually all that complicated. Things were pretty straightforward at this point when it became clear which map takes the win here. And of course, that would go to Blood Gulch from Halo Combat Evolved, the iconic level that even showed up in Fortnite and Minecraft on different occasions. But as far as official releases go, it takes the cake. It was in Halo Combat Evolved, then it was brought back in Halo 2 Coagulation with some Banshees thrown in there. Then, while we saw Valhalla take its place in Halo 3, it did make its return in Halo Reach as a part of Forge World in the form of Hemorrhage, a built-in Forge variation, but as we've said earlier, still counts here. Then in Halo 2 Anniversary, we saw it brought back yet again in the form of Bloodline. So that's easy right now. There's 4 variations, which would still have it kind of competitive there with Lockout. However, there is one more remake of Blood Gulch that often is overlooked, but it was remade in an official Halo game in the form of Halo Wars as a competitive map. And while this is a different instance of a remake, it definitely is Blood Gulch, and it's definitely in a Halo game, and it's an official licensed Halo game, so we count that, and that makes it where no matter where we end up ranking Lockout in this big debate, Blood Gulch still ends up just barely beating it out, unless we were willing to give it full points for Guardian, the Cage, and also that mysterious lost Lockout level. So at least for now, that's where we are with this ranking. It's one of those silly things that you don't really think about and question or talk about, and while there's a ton of really great community-made remakes out there, like the Halo 4 Lockout remake, or even Halo 5's Blood Gulch that exists out there, there's still something special when either Bungie or 343 creates something official that had a budget behind it and a team of professionals making something with all of the assets available in Halo and bring back and resurrect a map that was so iconic to a lot of our childhoods back in the day. So we would like to see Halo Infinite bring back some of these maps. It'd be really cool to see an Infinite Lockout or an Infinite Blood Gulch one day in the future, even if those maps have been remade over and over again. But what do you guys think about this? Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe with notifications on for more videos like this. See you all next time with a brand new video.